the limits of objectivity. Philosophy of the transcendental must necessarily present itself as a philosophy of objectivity. On one hand, objectivity and the transcendental can be distinguished to the extent that it's the necessity of thinking objectivity which makes thinking of the transcendental necessary. It is transcendental philosophy that limits and manifests it. One could say that it is the phenomenon. But on the other hand, there is a reciprocity between them which prevents us from giving a definition of one which does not imply that the other is already defined. For example, it is impossible to think of objectivity solely as a function of the domain in which it manifests itself as a function of experience. It is coextensive with this experience, but it is in the meaning that this experience takes for the subject who makes it the experience. It is therefore not one of the characteristics of experience, but it is that through which there is for a subject an experience. Far from freeing itself from the given, like an abstraction from its concrete environment, it gives to this given its meaning as given. It constitutes it an experience, what makes it an experience for the subject, and not pure exteriority. We must therefore think of objectivity not from experience, but from a not yet defined transcendental which makes an experience possible. It is the sign for consciousness that there is a transcendental world, which must first be defined. Conversely, transcendental activity can be considered as such, not as a practical activity, for example, to the extent that it is limited to the limits of objectivity. There is a sort of finality of the transcendental, which means that its scope is coextensive exactly at the very limits of objectivity. It would therefore be in vain to define the transcendental if we had not already defined the objectivity of which it is all the constitutive principles. An investigation in this area therefore seems to imply a choice, so it is possible to take as a starting point either an objectivity which is that of experience itself, or transcendental activity itself. Since for him the transcendental world has to be discovered in its entirety, it was normal that Kant began its examination with a definition of objectivity. In the second edition of the Critique, it opens with the preface, which is the definition of this objectivity as that of science. Such an attitude implies that one accepts the limits of experience even before having defined its legal conditions. That by following this notion as a guiding thread, one makes law the pure and simple legitimation of a fact. Instead of it being the pure idea of objectivity which guides reflection, it founds. It is science, devoid of a foundation, which imposes objectivity on reflection. One therefore experimentally gives oneself an objectivity which no longer has any right to legitimize this experience. This reproach is therefore more serious than that any other philosopher, which consists of reproaching Kant for his Newtonian thought. It would be good to reproach a philosopher for thinking only the science of his time, for confusing a science with science. If it were not in this case to reproach Kant for having confused science and what founds it, a world of objects with objectivity itself. This is not an error in the facts, it is an error in law, which it was to weigh heavily on the whole transcendental deduction. If a deduction from below and a deduction from above were necessary, it was because objectivity could not be defined only in terms of experience or in terms of the transcendental perception. But in fact, the two deductions are juxtaposed and in their parallelism cannot join. In one case, we start from the objectivity already defined, which this artifice allows us to find at all synthetic levels. In the other, we start from an activity which can never reach constitution of objectivity, since the latter was defined not by the fact that it was constituted, but by the fact that it presented itself as given. This means that in the deduction, an empiricism and an idealism are juxtaposed, both of which mark true objectivity. The first because it absorbs it in its implicit presuppositions, the second because it does not constitute what presents itself before any constitution as the already given. Because he had not found in a complete definition of objectivity the balance of a transcendental philosophy, Kant oscillated below and beyond an implicit empiricism to the temptation of an idealism. It is in this deduction from above that Fichte attempted to dispel the empiricist equivocation which weighs on the Kantian notion of objectivity. Fichte gives himself objectivity within the very heart of the transcendental, from the first process by which the self reveals itself as transcendental activity. It thus loses any phenomenal aspect of givenness. It does not appear, not even at the level of pure logical principle, A equals A. It is necessary in ficta, for it presents itself as a non-self, to wait for the transcendental self to reduce the deductive principle to its activity. It will therefore be caught up in this activity, overwhelmed by it. It will be its simple phenomenon, which no consistency will ever come to fill. And we thus arrived at the double paradox of a transcendental philosophy which cannot define a nature, while the transcendental has only one reason to exist, because it defines a totality of experiences constituting a nature, which makes the self and activity essentially practical, while transcendental activity must constitute the field of possible knowledge, in which, where appropriate, that of possible action and not vice versa. And this because then it would be no longer a limitation of rights, but a right to the absolute extension, what any negative concept of freedom can do. Ultimately, in Kant, the objectivity appeared too early, because at the very level of the given. With Fichte, it appeared too late, despite appearances, at a moment where transcendental activity was already in full play. In both cases, it lacked what was its nature, delimiting the transcendental field. During the periods of Bern, Frankfurt, and Jena, 1793 through 1806, Hegel conceived objectivity in a mode which recalls in its starting point the Kantian conception. It presents itself first of all as a pure given, the spontaneous and naive form of all experience. Far from being located at the transcendental level of a possible experience, it is the consistent character of a real experience. The very fact of being entirely taken into account by the experience, of being swallowed up in it, implies that the subject who undergoes the experience, they themselves are encompassed by it. It has no other meaning than being that for which there is an experience. At this level of experience, the subject who sees the light, who immerses himself in it, is nothing other than pure feeling of will. To contrast, it is not that Hegel conceives the subject and mode of Condillac's subject. If he confuses, for instance, objectivity with the world of objects, it is not to deduce the first from the second. Rather, it is that this confusion is only the gnoseological expression of a fundamental confusion in the period of Hegelian philosophy, that of a certain mode of knowing consciousness with its metaphysical situation. For example, if objectivity overflows consciousness everywhere in the hostile form of a world of foreign objects, it is because the subject was reduced to the ideal void of a pure subject. They had not found in love the means of doing so, one and the same thing with its object. Unhappy consciousness, in the broad and primitive sense of the term, of a consciousness split from God, is expressed in a way of being subject in relation to the object. The confusion of objectivity and the objects of the world only marks this moment, which immediately goes beyond itself. It appears, indeed, that this confusion expresses a figure of consciousness. Instead of confusing it with the world, it must be made an expression of consciousness itself. Ultimately, the reversal is immediate and is slow enough at the threshold of phenomenology. The ambiguity of the notion of objectivity. It was the very ambiguity of Kantianism, but this time expressed and self-conscious. At the other end of the system, in Wissenschaft der Logik, the same ambivalence, objectivity as figure of the world and figure of consciousness, will manifest itself, but presented in the opposite way. The purely conceptual framework of consciousness once constituted, it is a question of making the subjectivity of the system and the objectivity of nature, revealing in the non-objectivity of knowledge its true objectivity, because the pure idea of knowledge remains locked in subjectivity, because this subjectivity is not other than the concept of a subject who thinks an object. Therefore, the truth of this concept is the truth of this objectivity, and subjectivity reveals itself as a tendency to suppress oneself. The pure truth of logic, through this reversal, which is its ultimate result, finds itself founding the beginning of another science, that of nature, thus penetrating into the pure exteriority of space and time which exists in oneself without subjectivity. Phenomenology is situated between these two attempts to define objectivity, ideal void of the subject, nature without subjectivity, which correspond, to use Kantian terms, the first to the deduction from below, the second to the deduction from above. Now, the truth of objectivity is neither in one nor the other, but it is the passage from one to the other. Ultimately, it is in the distance which separates the two Kantian deductions, and the distance also which separates the early writings from logic, that the true definition of objectivity as the delimitation of the transcendental field is located. Since it is in the void left by Kantian deductions that Hegel places his definition of objectivity, he will have to bring together in it the two successive attitudes of Kant: ideal void of the subject, nature without subjectivity. This meeting, it will first have only the appearance of a unity. It, it is that the truth will itself be its own phenomenon. Objectivity and the subject knows develop first in the mode of reciprocal action. Each time the subject takes on a new figure, each time they live their experience in a new way, the objectivity of the experience is distorted and takes on an aspect still unknown. In the movement of perception, consciousness withdraws from the becoming of perception. It is the objectivity of this becoming which becomes the essence of consciousness. Conversely, when consciousness experiences the world as a dust of subjective experiences, objectivity vanishes, and in it the certainty of its freedom. The skeptical consciousness loses this other, which was for it the true and the real, and which is nothing other than objectivity. Therefore, this reciprocal movement is such that objectivity appears as the negative of subjectivity. Conversely, this union that Kant's associated deduction demanded appears, in reality, as the supreme opposition, in which the one is exclusive of the other. Moreover, it is no longer, as in Kant, the difference between a given and a transcendental activity. It is the pure and simple opposition of a subject of an object, in which no transcendental dimension is revealed. Objectivity is narrowed until it is no longer adequate other than as a contingency of objects. Now, it is this reduction of objectivity, this passion, one could say, which reduces objectivity to the mortal destiny of contingent objects, which allows us to think of the union of subjectivity and objectivity, because they appear as the reciprocal negativity of one another. Objectivity and subjectivity are contingent, fluctuating moments of a reality which alone remains. This reality, which stands between these two moving notions, is the thing itself, the object of honest consciousness. In it, consciousness recognizes its work, even if this work is not its own. In it, too, it recognizes the reality of the world. These two recognitions do not go without one another, since it is the honesty of consciousness to see the world in its action, and its action in the world. In other words, consciousness recognizes the thing itself, a subjectivity and an objectivity, which are one and the same thing. It is a penetration of the objective and the subjective, which immediately presents itself as objective itself, and is realized as the level of objectivity. If we had to wait for this moment to arrive at a conception of true objectivity, it is because pure and simple consciousness proved incapable of defining objectivity. Consciousness was consciousness of an object, consciousness of objectivity as the character of this object, which vanished before analysis, like the whiteness and solidity of the salt crystal. As soon as the object disappeared, consciousness fell back into the colorless void of subjectivity. The definition of objectivity is therefore marked in the phenomenology of spirit by two difficulties. The misfortune of consciousness, which, from one extreme to the other, from naive dogmatism to skepticism, sought a status for objectivity, has vanished in the face of the new solidity of the spirit, which is for itself objectivity. This is where the second difficulty manifests itself, since objectivity seems, in a diverse but nevertheless general way, to diffuse itself through all the experience of consciousness. Instead of representing the limit of the transcendental, that in which must confine one's investigation, rather it appears as absolutely limitless, whether it marks all the contingent representations or whether it accompanies the mind in all its transformations. What such a conception gains in extension and flexibility over the Kantian conception, too narrow, too mortgaged by prejudices, it immediately loses in unity, and if it does not initially prejudge a conception of the transcendental, it is incapable to define the characteristics of a transcendental field. At the still superficial level examination where we placed ourselves, these difficulties, when attempting to define the transcendental and the objective, they cannot appear as insurmountable. They can only give rise to a new series of problems, the solution of which is far from being thereby made impossible. Where Kant compromises his system, because he involves it entirely in preliminary difficulties which are not by nature intrinsic to his mode of reflection. Hegel lets these difficulties generate a series of questions of which it will be necessary to examine whether they do not lead to an impasse. To know if it is possible to find a principle of unity in objectivity, if it can define, as in Kant, a transcendental field, we will have to ask ourselves what the relationship of objectivity is with truth. That is to say, consider whether this overly vast objectivity does not play an inverse role to Kantian objectivity. Where Kant considered objectivity a form of truth, Hegel perhaps sees the truth as a form of objectivity. It is in any case a matter of discovering in objectivity what can only be accounted for by transcendental activity. From then on, it will be possible to wonder, first, if this conception of objectivity is not what made it necessary for the Hegelian system to pass through a phenomenology as an investigation of the transcendental domain. Secondly, if objectivity, swallowed up for a time in the world of objects, does not require anything other than a deduction of the Kantian type and capable of reaching the plenitude of phenomena where objectivity lies. These first difficulties are therefore more fruitful than embarrassing, since they require that we clarify the Hegelian conception of truth and its relationship with objectivity, the meaning that the notion of phenomenology takes on for the problem of the transcendental, and the two directions towards which phenomenology was oriented in the work of Hegel.